Hello there, and welcome into another episode of the Cannabis Man Podcast. Thank you for clicking on the show. I'm your host, Don Kleppen, and I want to say I really appreciate everybody who's been listening to the show and engaging with it. I love hearing from all of you, and I love hearing about how excited you are about the cannabis space as much as I am. There's so much going on, so much to talk about, and that's just a big part of why I wanted to start this show, and I've been loving the response that I've been getting from you, the listener. So keep it up. Love hearing from you, and I've got a lot to talk about this week. There has been a lot going on, and I've got some topics I want to get to, including which strain of the week that I have been imbibing, as well as a great interview with somebody I know you're going to love hearing from. This is someone who has been an advocate and an expert on cannabis for the last 3+ decades, and it's somebody who is involved at a very high level in the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, or NORML, which is an organization I'm sure you're familiar with. And we talk about a lot in that interview, especially some great perspective about, as frustrating as it can be. I know you and I, as exciting as this time with legal cannabis is, it's also can be so frustrating in terms of where we know things should be with the legal landscape and how far we still have to go. But as my guest today reminds us, over the last 30+ years, there has been a lot of serious, significant progress in legal cannabis, and the momentum is still there. We are not by any means at the final resting place. We're not at the finish line in terms of where cannabis ends up legally in the United States. There's still a lot happening. But when you look at, what the landscape was like 30 years ago in 1993, from when I'm recording this, things were very, very different here in the U.S. and around the world in terms of cannabis and the prohibition. And there was no real momentum then for legal cannabis in the U.S., and here we are now talking about safer banking being passed soon, as well as the rescheduling of cannabis, making it Schedule 3. There's a lot to be excited about here, and my guest today reminds us that as frustrating as it can be today, wishing that things were different, they are very different from where they were just a few decades ago. So that's a great interview. I look forward to sharing that with you. Also going to talk about the strain of the week that I've been smoking on, another FloraCal flower product, and a couple of news stories and events in the News Joint Wrap, as well as something else that I found was very interesting as a study that was released, and some new information about traffic death rates in states that legalize cannabis versus states that have not. And you may be surprised to find out what they found in that study. So I'll bring that to you later this episode. If you want to follow along with the show, any updates that you'd care to get, it's at C-Man Podcast on X and Instagram, the Cannabis Man Podcast on Facebook, YouTube, and TikTok. You can always contact the show via the website as well. And that website has undergone a change. My site for the show is now cannabisman.buzzsprout.com. I'm using the platform that I create the show on and that I publish it on. It generates a web page, and I just decided to go that route instead of the former page because that was costing me a little bit of money that ultimately I decided was superfluous, if you like. So the new site is cannabisman.buzzsprout.com. You can click on the show description notes. It'll take you there if you like. And if you ever want to support the show, you can scroll down to the description notes and click on the support show link. It'll take you to the subscriber page through Buzzsprout, and you can support the show however you feel like. I really appreciate everybody who's done that and everyone who continues to support the show. It's what makes this possible, and I really, really do appreciate it. Trying to bring you some good cannabis conversations, some perspectives, and some news related to this legal cannabis space. And so anybody who helps me do that, I really throw you an extra tip of the cap, because without you, this show doesn't happen. So thank you very much. And some personal news. It has been a busy year for me and my family here, listener. As you may know, I got married earlier this year to my wife, Gretchen. We got married in June 11th of 2023, and then we were right off on our honeymoon on Maui, which was absolutely beautiful and lovely. And we got out of Maui, got off the island about a week or so before the fires took over that island. So I'm very, very thankful that Gretchen and I were able to go and see this magical place and have such a wonderful time there. 2 weeks just full of memories. We got to see the banyan tree. We got to see so much. Mount Haleakala, just an excellent place. And, the fires have devastated it. So if you've heard plenty about this, I know over the summer, we certainly gave what we could to donate to the Maui Rescue Fund, and anybody else who can do that. It's definitely a place worth saving. But I bring that up because there has been another development in my personal life and some news that Gretchen and I shared with our families on Sunday and that we put out on social media earlier in this week. But I wanted to tell you as well, listener, because I'm telling everybody I'm excited. Gretchen is pregnant, and we are expecting our first child come April of 2024. And I'm over the moon. I really can't even express how crazy to me it is, how much life can change in a short time. I mean, looking at a year ago, we were engaged and we were looking forward to our wedding and honeymoon and all that. But now we're looking at a whole different part of life, a whole different chapter. And I'm so excited and thrilled to explore that with her. And I'm really, really looking forward to bringing a new Kleppen into the world. This is, it's an exciting time, and I'm just so happy. And I wanted to share that news with you because in just 6 short months, there'll be another Kleppen here running around this house, and maybe I'll get some recordings of the little guy or girl. We're not going to know which it is until they're born. We decided that we would rather not know the gender until they are delivered in that room, and we'll find out then which we have. So we're both very excited about that, and life keeps on moving, as does legal cannabis in the U.S. Lots to talk about regarding that, and so let's get into this episode of the Cannabis Man Podcast.
This is Tommy Chong, and you're listening to the Cannabis Broadcast.
Yeah, there we are, listener. Okay, let's get into the strain of the week. I've got my coffee here. Listener, if you've listened to the show before, you know that I love my cannabis and coffee, and that's the combo that I'm vibing on this morning, so cheers to you. If you're listening in the afternoon, evening, or morning, I hope you got a drink in your hand or just something that helps you feel the vibe for the day, feel a good vibe, puts you in a nice mental place. Whatever that might be, cheers to you, and hope you have a great day. So, the strain that I've been smoking on this week is the final FloraCal Farms product, the flower from them that I was able to try, courtesy of Cresco Labs. I was able to speak with somebody from Cresco, Dana Mason, of their marketing department, wholesale marketing, and she shared a lot about Cresco's philosophy and about some of the products that they've got, some of the popular ones. I'm sure if you're an Illinois listener or other states, you may be familiar with Sunnyside and Cresco. I really had a great conversation with her, and I look forward to bringing you that in the next few weeks here. But the final FloraCal flower that I smoked on, courtesy of Cresco, was Kush Mints. This is a lineage between Bubba Kush BX1 and Animal Mints. It's an indica dominant strain, and the dominant terpenes are caryophyllene, limonene, and myrcene. It's a minty flavor. It smells lemony and minty, clean and sharp. That's sort of what I wrote down here. Physically, you get these leafy green buds, mid-grade frost, not like the frost is falling off of the leaves or the buds, but it is definitely a frosty batch. This was harvested May 23rd and packaged June 7th. The THCA listed as 32.41%. As I said, I got kind of a minty taste, but on the back end of it, I also almost got a little bit of a cheesy flavor, kind of something that was off the mint a little bit. Not unpleasant at all, and I wouldn't describe it as like a cheese mint, whatever that is, but you get kind of both separately. You get the minty flavor on the inhale and kind of a cheesy burn on the exhale. The feel that I got as I wrote these down, listener, that I've tried to start as I'm reviewing these, I try and check in with myself every 15, 20 minutes, at least for the first hour or two after smoking or imbibing the edible, whatever it is that I'm ingesting. I'm trying to give you a little bit more detailed feedback. So I'm reviewing these. I check in with myself every 15 minutes. I felt pretty upbeat for an indica on Cushman's. Some release from muscle soreness I'd been feeling, and I kind of was wondering to myself if it's a legitimate pain relief or just kind of a mental distraction from the pain I've been feeling. I'm sure you've experienced this too if you've been sick or feeling some negative symptoms from something. One of the great things about cannabis is that sometimes it provides you with actual relief from that chronic pain. If you've got joint pain or body pain, it can provide you relief from that. But if you've ever tried it while you're sick, it also sort of provides like a mental break where it may not actually get rid of your symptoms, but it can bring your mind to a place where you're not fixated on those symptoms and you can just kind of get around your day. You can do things without sitting there focusing on them. So I was kind of wondering if that was the case with this Cushman's, if it was actually giving me relief from muscle soreness or if it was just kind of a distraction. After about 20 minutes, I realized that it was genuine relief from the body pain. Again, just muscle soreness from working out. It wasn't anything more significant than that for me. So I'd be interested to hear how you feel about Cushman's. Try it out. I got some minor munchies, and I went for these cauliflower tortilla chips we had, nacho cheese flavor, and those were definitely not bad. I enjoyed those, although later on, I continued my writing here, and I say the munchies graduated from minor to major. I poured a bowl of Raisin Bran Crunch, not too much, with some almond milk, and I decided to add some chocolate syrup into there. I was munching pretty hard, and followed by some graham crackers and whipped cream. I went on a bit of a snack binge. 30 to 60 minutes in, totally zonked, as I wrote down. Back of my head and the temples really felt it. I was definitely feeling the indica. I could still function, but, in terms of the efficacy or in terms of the efficiency of my functioning, I definitely wouldn't have been doing something like my taxes or whatever. I was functioning like making a bowl of Raisin Bran with putting chocolate syrup into the almond milk. That was the level of function that I was really going with here, and maybe playing a video game or watching something. But that was my experience with Cushman's, and I really, really enjoyed it. If you like indica, and one that does zonk you out, but still allows you to kind of peel yourself away from the couch every now and again and maybe do a couple of things, munch in whatever's in your cabinets, but also just kind of have a fun, good time, nice body high, and also feeling that spacey kind of kooky feel in your mind. That is what I got from Cushman's, and if you try it, let me know what you thought about it. Hit me up at C-Man Podcast on X or Instagram and email the show, go to the website. Any feelings that you have for this particular brand or anything else you're trying, always let me know what you thought. Now let's jump into the News Joint Wrap. That's right, this is the portion of the show where I give you some events and news stories coming up in and around Illinois, all brought to you by IllinoisNewsJoint.com. Think of it as the joint you can hit for all your Illinois cannabis news and reviews. And let's start with the Illinois Cannabis Cup Awards ceremony, which is going to air November 6th, just a few days from when this episode is being released here. It's the 4th annual Illinois High Times Magazine People's Choice Cannabis Cup Awards. And after the judges reviewed their 2023 kits, you may remember these went for sale in August. I did a highlighting episode about that. The award ceremony is set to stream at 4:20 p.m. on Monday, November 6th. You can check it out at the High Times Facebook page. Categories include indica, sativa, and hybrid flowers, pre-rolls, infused and non, solvent concentrates, non-solvents, vape pens and cartridges, and edibles, gummies and fruit chews, chocolates and non-gummies, and beverages. along with topicals, tinctures, capsules, and sublinguals. And then you get medical flower, vape pens, and carts and edibles as well. All of those will be looked into, and you will find out which categories anyway, which products in those categories that Illinois cannabis judges felt were the best. Moving on to the next story, new cannabis tax rates are going to start on cannabis products January 1st of 24. This is from a bulletin from Illinois Department of Revenue, and they highlight the rates here. It may not exceed 3%, but these are not going to replace the existing taxes on municipalities. These are in addition to. So listen here, in unincorporated areas of the county, the rate may not exceed 3.75%. In municipally located county places, the rate may not exceed 3%. But again, so you will start to see, again, I know we're not thrilled about the prices of cannabis products here in Illinois, but you're about to see a little bit of a bump in those prices, even more so, 3.75 in unincorporated parts of Cook and other Illinois counties, 3% in the municipalities there, and those tax bumps are going to increase even by a little bit the prices that you are paying for your Illinois cannabis products. And one more news story here from IllinoisNewsJoint.com. Green Rose files the 1,500-foot rule lawsuit against IDFPR. Green Rose dispensary representatives last week sent out a press release stating that GRI Holdings filed a lawsuit in the Circuit Court of Cook County to stop another social equity cannabis dispensary from opening in River North at the old Rainforest Cafe location. I've been eyeing the process of this, listener, because I've been so interested for when that Rainforest Cafe dispensary was going to open, and now it seems there'll be another lengthy delay in this process because of this lawsuit filed by Green Rose Dispensary. The 1,500-foot rule is meant to keep it so that we're not getting a huge influx of dispensaries in any one location. River North, as you know, of Chicago, is a very hot location for bars, restaurants, clubs, as well as now dispensaries. I've gone to the Sunnyside in River North there. There are several other options very nearby. This is related to the 1,500-foot rule. GRI Holdings claims the CRTA prohibits cannabis dispensaries from locating within 1,500 feet of another cannabis dispensary to avoid neighborhoods from becoming overrun with dispensaries and keep them economically viable. We've talked about some other markets that have legalized cannabis on the show before, listener, and as you may have heard me say, when different markets just throw the doors open and let anybody become a dispenser of legal cannabis, and then you have those same businesses opening up dispensaries, 10, 15 feet from one another, we see what happens with gas stations and fast food restaurants as well. Anytime that an area becomes overrun, a lot of those businesses are going to suffer. Their profits are just not going to be there because somebody will find the bottom of pricing, and then consumers will just end up going to that one, and all the others that have opened in the area ultimately end up falling short of making profits that they would need in order to sustain their operations. So that is what is at heart of this lawsuit that Green Rose filed against the Department of Professional and Financial Regulation of the state, and that is going through the courts right now. We will see where that ends up, and I will certainly bring you any details or updates on that story, as well as any other news stories and events coming out in or around Illinois related to cannabis on the News Joint Wrap, brought to you by IllinoisNewsJoint.com. Listener, strap in. We have a very special guest today, and I'm very excited to talk with him. This is a man who has over 30 years of professional experience working on cannabis policy, and he focuses especially on science and data. He's authored several books on cannabis policy, review papers, and hundreds of op-eds, a recent one of which was published, and I'm so thrilled to talk with him about it. His op-ed kind of called out some of the media coverage that I've I've mentioned on this show, which was depicting the harm from cannabis smoke and tobacco smoke as equal. In addition to that, my guest was the lead witness last year at a congressional hearing at the House Oversight Committee on cannabis policy, and he has done so much for the work. He's currently the deputy director of an organization you may have heard of, the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, aka NORML. Listener, please welcome to the show, Paul Armentano. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you again. And did I have that right? I just want to make sure I had your title correct with NORML. Was that about right?
Yes, I am the current deputy director of NORML, and yes, I have been working in this arena going on 30 years. Much of that time I have spent working with NORML to try to reform America's archaic and failed marijuana policies.
Yes, and thank you for the work that you do at NORML. It is absolutely leading the way in terms of the effort to, as you said, change these archaic cannabis laws that we have. And we are still, we're recording this is October 23rd of 2023. I'm here in Illinois. They legalized recreationally 4 years ago. Medicinally, different states have done that over the years and such. But just to get started, how do you feel today about the state of cannabis, legal cannabis in the United States, with this patchwork of legalization that we have rather than a federal policy here? How do you feel about it?
I think it's very predictable. When I got into this space 30 plus years ago, keep in mind, there were no jurisdictions in this country where medical cannabis was legally permitted, and there were no jurisdictions in this country where the adult use of marijuana was either legal or regulated. And when it came to the conversations that were taking place about cannabis policy at the federal level, one of the first couple of years I was in Washington, D.C. doing this work, one of the only pieces of legislation that received any level of debate in Congress when it came to marijuana policy was a bill that was introduced by then Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, that sought to impose the death penalty for the importation of more than 2 ounces of cannabis into the United States.
Oh, my God.
So that was the landscape 3 decades ago. Today, things obviously are very different. We have 23 states, like Illinois, where the adult use of marijuana is legally regulated. We have 38 states where a physician can authorize a qualifying patient to access medical marijuana products. And we have had, on 2 separate occasions, the House of Representatives pass legislation that would remove cannabis from its Schedule I classification under federal law, thereby allowing states the authority and autonomy to set their own marijuana policies free from any undue federal interference. So while there's still much work to be done, we have made great strides in these last 3 decades. And I do want to remind your listeners that we live in a federal republic. There is not going to be a scenario where the federal government is going to wave a magic wand and mandate all 50 states in Washington, D.C. legalize marijuana and set the same marijuana policies. That wasn't the case with alcohol. When the federal government repealed the federal prohibition of alcohol, it did not mandate states to legalize alcohol. It simply got out of the way and allowed individual states to make their own individual decisions and set their own individual alcohol policies. That's why we have a patchwork of policies amongst the states when it comes to how they regulate alcohol. Where I grew up in Connecticut, they regulate alcohol much differently than California or Texas. So to see this sort of patchwork system play out with respect to marijuana, A, it's a significant victory. B, it's really a manifestation of how our political system operates.
Right on. And I really appreciate you kind of spelling that out. The historical perspective you just provided to everybody 30 years ago, I mean, just for a moment, I know so many of the listeners are younger. So just for a moment, imagine that the debate in Congress was about potentially adding the death penalty for importing more than 2 ounces of cannabis. I mean, that puts into perspective how far we've come from that. The fact that, here in Illinois and other legal states, you can just go buy with or without a medical card. You can buy this product. And some states, with the hemp bill, recently enacted at lower than a certain threshold for THC, you can send it in the mail you can send certain products to other states. So I really appreciate you, Paul, putting that perspective out there, because there's so much frustration from people still, because as you said, there's still a lot of work to be done. It's not perfect, but we have come a long way, and it is a very exciting time.
Yeah, and I would also emphasize, because we are recording this just days after the FBI reported their latest uniform crime report. According to the FBI, there were about 225,000 arrests made in the year 2022 for marijuana. Obviously, even one arrest of an adult consumer is one too many. But again, to put that number in perspective, in 2007, there were nearly 1 million arrests made in this country for marijuana violations. So when we look at the different sort of metrics here, how many states have legalized, is medical marijuana becoming more accessible? To me, that's the most important metric. How many arrests have we eliminated? How many opportunities have we had to stop law enforcement and the heavy hand of police from ruining people's lives? And we have seen those arrests decline fourfold in this country over the last decade. That's a direct result of the changes in policy that is taking place in states like Illinois and elsewhere.
Absolutely. And another great point, and it gets to exactly what you focus on, which is this sort of data, which is these numbers, the scientific facts about arrest numbers and the like, and those sorts of things. And I mentioned the op-ed that you recently wrote, and I want to just, bring, this attention to this for the listener, because this is something I mentioned when it first came out. And the title of the op-ed that I'm discussing here is "Let's Dispel the Myth that Cannabis and Tobacco Smoke are equally hazardous to your health." And I won't, go through the entirety of it, but you make a lot of great points in here, Paul. And I just wanted to applaud you, because before we started recording here, we were discussing about how certain media publications, and I'll call out CNN specifically because I mentioned it before, they seemed almost eager to run with an anti or a negative coverage of cannabis whenever studies like these seem to come out. You quoted one of their articles recently. Many Americans wrongly believe exposure to marijuana smoke is safer than tobacco and other such likes. Can talk a little about what prompted you to write this op-ed and why we know, what's the data that backs up that cannabis smoke and tobacco smoke are not equal in terms of harm?
Well, it's quite interesting. There was a study that was published where the researchers were asking members of the American public to weigh in on this topic and to discuss which particular behavior they thought was more potentially hazardous to health, smoking tobacco or smoking cannabis. A majority of the respondents who spoke with the researchers answered that question correctly. They said, well, clearly smoking tobacco is far more dangerous than smoking marijuana, which is consistent with what the available evidence tells us. For whatever reason, that answer seemed to really get under the skin of the researchers who wrote this article, who had the audacity to basically say, the public's got this wrong. they've been misled on this, because we know that there's no possible way anybody can inhale any kind of combusted smoke safely, and they should have answered the question that both of these behaviors are equally harmful. And that was sort of the commentary that they put out in their study. And that was the commentary that CNN and a number of other outlets ran with, that they put in their headline and that they tried to validate in the course of their reporting, which, as you can imagine, was very difficult to do because, again, the scientific data that we have literally decades of doesn't substantiate that position, but does substantiate what the public said, that if you are to weigh the hazards of smoking tobacco versus the potential risks of smoking marijuana, that clearly the use of marijuana does not possess anywhere near the sort of known substantive risks that are associated with years of tobacco use.
You spell out in the op-ed, you give a few examples, CNN included, some other publications, how they spun the results of these surveys that you were just saying. And, and then you say, in fact, it's the news media that's in error. It is almost interesting. We're supposed to think of these publications as having journalistic integrity. Like, they just report the facts and they're neutral, so they don't feel one way or the other about these things. That's what we're supposed to believe. But, as you just pointed out, it's like they poll the public answers a question correctly, not even incorrectly, but correctly. And it seems like the researchers, the poll takers were pissed off, like they were irked by the correctness of the knowledge. And then all of a sudden, publications like CNN, then they're taking their time to try and sway the narrative back in the other direction. They put out other articles, they put out things with headlines like these, which are meant to tell people, hey, the public's wrong about this. So anyone you hear saying this, no, you're supposed to believe the other thing. And what says to me is like, well, why are you so invested in swinging that narrative the other way? Why do you feel so badly that the public is believing this truth about cannabis smoke versus tobacco? And I just can't really get my arms around it still, but I have suspicions and all that. And I know that, CNN, at least as far as I've been paying attention to this, in the last, 10, 20 years, as far as I can see it, CNN has been consistent in this sort of attitude toward cannabis coverage. Would you agree with that?
I would. Their coverage generally is relatively sensational when it comes to addressing cannabis, and they are clearly very selective in the papers or the highlights that they choose to elevate. And 9 times out of 10, those are typically papers that are purporting to find some negative association, whereas papers that have either a null effect or potentially a positive conclusion are generally ignored. But I don't want to just pick on CNN. They're hardly alone in their relatively poor marijuana coverage. But I would highlight the fact that whether we're talking about CNN or so many of these other networks, is there's this lack of institutional memory. And that really, I thought, came to the forefront when you looked at how some of these publications reported on this recent paper. It wasn't that long ago. It was probably about 15 years ago, where the premier longitudinal study looking at the impact of smoking marijuana long-term on the lungs was published by researchers at UCLA. This was a federally funded study. It was a case control study, so you had thousands of people enrolled in the study. Many of them used cannabis. Others did not use cannabis. And researchers essentially tracked these individuals and assessed their lung health over about a 20-year span. And at the end of this study, what the researchers at UCLA concluded was that the individuals who were long-term cannabis smokers had no elevated risk of lung cancer or other respiratory diseases. That paper was published. Summaries of that paper appeared in the Washington Post and throughout mainstream news networks all around this country. If you were paying attention, you would not have missed the results of that study. So for writers at CNN and some of these other media outlets to go forward with the narrative they did, they have to be willfully ignorant of news, of materials that were previously reported by the same mainstream media, but apparently just went down the memory hole.
Yeah, exactly. It sort of gets at, as you said, short institutional memory. And I know people like to kind of point, recency bias is obviously, I don't know if you call it a fault of the human condition or what, but there are certainly some that seem to suffer from that more than others. And in the case of the media, though, this is, as you point out, it's supposed to be kind of like a catalog, a chronicling of life and truth. And there's a whole database of information, of publications, of headlines, TV news articles, radio stories. There's a whole, ever since media has existed in the country, there is a record of it. You can go back and you can search these things. So the fact that people either willfully ignored it or were ignorant of it and didn't do the proper research before they ran with the narrative, I think it is telling, whichever sort of, side of that, you buy more into. Let me ask you, Paul, since you've been doing this for over 30 years and you do look at the data and you are so well informed about everything going on here, I was speaking with someone last week as the House was taking their second vote for a speaker, actually, and I had spoken with people when the Senate passed safer banking, had passed their most recent version of the banking cannabis bill that would allow for businesses to get on the federal banking system and whatnot. Let me ask you, aside from the craziness happening in the House right now, how close do you feel that safer banking and cannabis businesses being able to access bank accounts like the rest of us do, how close do you feel that is?
I think it's a very difficult question to answer. Honestly, I thought the greatest opportunity or the greatest window for passing that sort of important reform legislation was in the previous Congress. And once that window closed, the pathway forwards were going to get much more difficult. There are a number of reasons why I think it's going to be a very heavy lift to pass any sort of significant cannabis reform legislation in this Congress. Some of those reasons have to do with the fact that there is resistance among some folks in Congress when it comes to this issue, but much of it simply has to do with simply the dysfunctional situation that Congress is in and the fact that we're heading toward an election next year and we have a deeply divided government and neither side wants to give the other a win on anything heading into election. But you are correct that this is legislation that I do think is sorely needed. It is difficult, if not impossible, for a multi-billion-dollar industry like this to operate largely on a cash-only basis, and for startups and new entrepreneurs in this industry to be able to get a foothold in it without having access to traditional lending or even things like bankruptcy protection. So certainly this is something that is needed. I don't have a crystal ball and can't give you a prediction on when I think Congress will actually go ahead and enact these reforms.
Totally. I completely understand. And you bring up great, fair points, and I appreciate that. And I've talked on the show. I mean, the need for it is really kind of what I was just wanted to talk about because, as you said, this is a multi-billion-dollar industry, and we've had people on the show. I've talked with many on and off the mic here about the notion that you are the crime. You're making these businesses targets of robbers and thieves and whatnot because they know that they're all dealing in all cash. Whatever state this is, the secret, it's not a secret. It never has been. They know that what the deal is, that these businesses have to operate on a cash basis. And that makes the workers, that makes the businesses themselves just ripe targets for crime. And that, if nothing else, I mean, you're talking about Americans in danger as well as businesses. That alone should be...
You're putting their consumers at risk as well.
Of
because
course.
criminals know that the consumers that are coming and going with those establishments also have to be dealing in all cash.
100%. So I agree with you, and I know that it is frustrating, and for all the reasons you laid out. There are some, I know I've heard, Senator Chuck Schumer is apparently still planning to bring safer banking to the floor, and I do think that you spelled out a lot of reasons why it may still not happen. We are only a year or so out from the next election. We're in a deeply divided political climate here, and nobody does want to give the other a win. So it's disappointing, but it does kind of feel like things are going to stand pat for the moment anyway. Let me ask you as well here, in terms of data and in terms of the studies that are being done. One doctor that I've spoken with on the show mentioned that a lot of these studies are reliant on self-reporting, because of just the nature of how these things are done, in terms of laws and
Sure.
what studies are green lit, federally and whatnot. A lot of them are kind of all they can do in terms of measurement is take self-reported data from those who are participating. Where do you think that I guess what I'm trying to ask is, what do you think the most valuable studies, can be done in the immediate, or I guess maybe what needs to change federally so that we can answer some of these questions with hard data, that you're talking about, some of the questions about cannabis that we all have?
Well, I'm really glad you asked that question because I think it gets to really the crux of one of these issues. I got into this work 30 years ago with this idea that we needed to change the narrative. We needed to change the way people talk about cannabis in this country, because once we begin to change the way people talk about it, we'll begin to change the way people think about it, and then we'll be able to change policy. And I've been very proud over the last 30 years of the changes that I have seen with respect to our conversations about cannabis. But the one narrative that I feel continues to persist, that I find most personally vexing, is this notion that we don't know enough about cannabis and its effects because it hasn't been sufficiently studied. That was a predominant narrative 30 years ago when I began this work. It remains a prominent narrative now, and it is absolutely, unequivocally not true. We have over 45,000 peer-reviewed scientific studies dedicated to the cannabis plant, its constituents, and their effects. We've had about 30,000 of those studies published just within about the last decade and a half. The United States is the world leader in cannabis research. I would dare say there is very little, if anything, that we don't know about cannabis. We know its active constituents. We know the receptors in the body that they act upon. We know what the purpose of that receptor system is. We understand the mechanism of action. We understand the real world effects to individuals and to society when they use cannabis. We understand the long-term effects of human use and societal use of cannabis because human beings have been using this substance for literally thousands of years. It's really time we as a society start acknowledging and talking about what we do know about cannabis and start harping on the fact that supposedly there is so much we don't know about cannabis. The reality is that the information, the science is there. And just because you, and I don't mean you personally, but you as a politician or you as a doctor,
Right.
Just because you might not be aware of that data doesn't mean that we as a society aren't aware of the data. The problem has never been we don't have enough research. The problem is that we have had marijuana policies in this country, and all too often conversations about marijuana policy in this country that are divorced from what the scientific data and from what the scientific record tells us. We had just last year alone, over 4,500 published papers about cannabis. We'll have more than that this year. We've had year over year a growing number of scientific papers going back to 1990. Every single year since then, we've seen more publications about cannabis the coming year than the year before that. Again, this isn't a matter of what we don't know. We should be talking about what we do know. And we know a whole hell of a lot.
I love it. I love it, Paul. I thank you so much for that response. I feel that completely. I mean, you mentioned about like the narrative and the conversations about cannabis. It's in my own little small way, what I'm doing here with the show. That's what prompted me to start this, was literally that. The fact that once it was legalized here in Illinois, it felt to me like everybody kept saying the same things, that people were much more familiar about stoner jokes and punchlines and the sort of reefer madness stuff than they were about potential quality of life improvements and health benefits. And so believe me, I'm right there with you, and I appreciate all the work that you've done too. And when we talk about that, what we do know, like let's just, the stuff that we do know, what we know is that cannabis long term is way less detrimental, is way less harmful to human beings than alcohol and tobacco. And both of those are fully normalized and fully parts of our society, so much to the point that, like, try going to a party with people and not having a drink and see, if nobody brings it up. I do think that thankfully we're moving, more in the direction of mocktails and, with cannabis starting to grow in different states that have it, you do start to see some alcohol rates, go down. Certainly anecdotally, in my regard here, that's just what I hear from most of the people that are using it after a while, and I think that is a great thing. Can we talk just a little bit briefly here about that we do know? We do know that alcohol and tobacco are so harmful, but they are such normal, regular parts of everyday life, and cannabis isn't. I don't want to ask you, how do we change that? But, obviously you're doing work at NORML to try and do this. Can you see a day when cannabis, when the positions are flipped, when this country is more normal and receptive toward cannabis use than alcohol or tobacco?
I think we're actually getting to a point right now where cannabis is seen by society far more favorably than tobacco. I don't necessarily think we'll get to a point, nor even is it any sort of personal goal of mine, to get to a point where cannabis, say, becomes as ubiquitous or more ubiquitous than alcohol. Frankly, personally, I find the ubiquity of alcohol to be somewhat problematic in this society. The fact that I couldn't sit down and go through 30 minutes of a nationally broadcasted ball game with my young son and not be inundated with advertising for alcohol. I think that's a problem. I wouldn't necessarily want to see cannabis treated that same way. But you're certainly correct that when it comes to potential long-term harms, that the harms associated to both society and to the individual user's health associated with alcohol and tobacco are far more significant than those associated with cannabis. And there might be some of your listeners out there saying, well, how do you know that, Paul? And it's because, again, this question has been asked and answered. This has been studied. That's how we know. We have dozens and dozens of longitudinal studies where individuals are recruited in their late teens or early 20s, and scientists follow them for the next 20, 30 years. And they divide these folks up into cannabis-only users and alcohol-only users and tobacco-only users and those that use combinations of all of the different substances. And they track their cardiovascular health and their lung health and their brain health and a number of different issues. And again, we have this data. That's how we can make these statements definitively. We don't have to ask what if, we know.
I love it. I love it, Paul. I cannot thank you enough for doing the work that you do and saying it, and keeping the flame alive, keeping this passion that you clearly have for cannabis and this fight that we are still fighting every day here in this country. But as you said, and which I really appreciate from from you is the perspective about how far we have come, because I think that there is excitement about cannabis, but as you know too, there is still a lot of pushback, and for different reasons from different groups. And I think that it's important. There are people that get frustrated, that are overwhelmed, and that are constantly, they're tired of sort of fighting this fight, and they wish that it was just sort of, normal the way that we treat it in our own individual lives. And I do think that it's such an important point that you make, that we have moved. We've made progress. Things are a lot different now in 2023 than they were in the 90s concerning cannabis in this country. And I just wanted to thank you for the work that you're doing at NORML and the work that you've done as an individual in this fight to help move cannabis to this place where it is more normalized, and the stigma, of the last century can hopefully and finally just be dead already, Yeah,
and I think bringing up the stigma is really important, because I think for younger generations today, particularly in jurisdictions like in Illinois or California or Oregon or these states where cannabis is legal, and where entire generations are growing up not knowing an environment where cannabis isn't legal or illegally available and regulated. I think that is going to do so much to eliminate this stigma that folks like me in previous generations had to endure. And of course, that was by design. Part of the policy surrounding cannabis was to stigmatize the users of cannabis, so that they would remain in the shadows, so that they could, the media and others could maintain stereotypes about cannabis. And there were very few people that were going to self-identify and buck those trends, because that stigma was so prevalent. That stigma could cost you your job. It could cost you your livelihood. It could cost you your family. That has changed dramatically in the last few decades. And I think that is going to be a really powerful harbinger to the fact that we are not going to take significant step backwards in the coming years, but we're going to continue to move forward, because for so many people, that stigma doesn't exist anymore, and it's not going to hold people back with respect to being honest about their own use of cannabis.
Right on. And that is a very encouraging note. I totally agree with you. I was just reading a book, iGen, about the Gen Z, those born in 95 and after. And overwhelmingly, the stats show that they would rather consume marijuana than alcohol, and that they don't identify that stigma we were just talking about. They don't have that. So I think the point you just made about how younger people growing up in this world where the stigma doesn't exist, that is going to move the needle forward. That's going to move us closer to this place of normalization. And, eventually that stigma, it seems like based on that it will die off someday, which is very exciting.
And I don't think younger people see cannabis as part of a larger culture war anymore. And that was clearly an issue that held reform and progress back for quite some time. Oftentimes I said, the conversations we're having, they're not about cannabis per se. They're about what certain generations feel that cannabis represents. This idea that somehow if you're using cannabis, you're un-American or you're not patriotic. Again, younger generations aren't saddled with that sort of baggage. They just see cannabis as either a therapeutic agent or a mild intoxicant, and it doesn't carry all of this additional baggage along with it. And that is going to make it much easier, I think, in the future for younger generations to continue this fight and to be successful.
Well, that's wonderful, and it's a great positive note, I think, to kind of end on, and I really, really do appreciate your time. Paul Armentano, Deputy Director of NORML, as well as a tireless advocate for cannabis. Thank you for the work you're doing at NORML, and thank you for so many great op-eds and the books you've written, and keep banging the drum, my man. I really, really appreciate warriors like you in this fight.
Well, I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to have these conversations with you and with your listeners. And I want to make people know that, this fight isn't over and marijuana doesn't legalize itself. These changes take place because of hardworking individuals like me, like my colleagues at NORML, and because of folks like you and your listeners. Because NORML is a grassroots organization. We survive on the donations of our members, on the volunteering of our activists. And if folks want to get involved, and I encourage them to do so, they can look us up online at norml.org.
That's great. Thank you, Paul. I appreciate you mentioning that. I had intended to ask you how people could get involved. I'm really glad that you put that out there. So, listener, as you just heard, get over to norml.org and give and get in this fight with the rest of us, because this is really important stuff. Paul Armentano, thank you for the time today.
Thank you for having me. It's been fun.
And there you have it, listener. I really want to thank my guest, Paul Armentano. He really gave us such valuable perspective there, because I know doing this show and just kind of walking around day to day as a cannabis consumer in 2023, I know we all get frustrated, time after time when things like safer banking get stalled in Congress again because they can't pick a speaker. And I know that we're all frustrated in Illinois, where it's like the trickle of competition among dispensaries has been so slow because of lawsuits, and so competition is not high enough and prices stay high. I know that the perfect version of legal cannabis that exists in all of our minds, I know that we're frustrated that reality does not meet those expectations, does not equate to those standards. I know that. But as Paul pointed out, you have to think of this in terms of what the last 100 years was like. Since 1937, this has been prohibited at a level of not just, you can't buy 3 ounces for $90. It's not just the price point. There are still people who are sitting in cells for using a small amount of cannabis in some states. The slow removal of this prohibition, it may not be moving as fast as we would like. It may not meet the ideal standard that we have in our heads, but we are moving. And government moves at a glacial pace at best. And the fact that we're at this place now where we do see safer banking, it's on the verge of passage. The threshold that it needs to pass the House, it's almost there, even with this new speaker who is supposedly very anti-cannabis. The American people are still pushing for this to be done. It will still be done. The constituents are making their voices heard. And if you haven't called your elected representatives in a while or left an email in their offices, whether it's for the House or for your senator, go ahead and do that. This week might be a good one. Remind them that safer banking is top priority. Let's get these cannabis businesses off of a place where they need to use cash only, and the rest of us don't need to pay those garbage ATM fees when you're using your card at a dispensary. We all want this to be happening, and it's going to happen soon. And then, Biden and his administration talking about rescheduling. The 2024 presidential election is going to be huge for the prospect of rescheduling cannabis down to Schedule 3 from Schedule 1. Those things are happening now. They're in the process of it, and very soon they'll be reality. And I think 30 years ago, if you could go back in time and tell somebody 30 years ago that this was going to be reality this year, I think they would have been thrilled. I think a lot of us would have been over the moon at the prospect that this finally was going to be changed. And it's important to keep that perspective in your mind right now. Patience, perspective. I know it's not that easy, especially if you know somebody or if you are somebody who's in jail or your life has been impacted by that war on drugs. That's such a failure. I understand that it may not be easy to maintain this patience, but it's the best that we can do. And just know in your heart that this is changing. The world is changing, and it doesn't often happen at a quick pace. It's not like you wake up one day always and the world is totally different. It's not a threshold the same way that like the COVID pandemic or the war in Ukraine or in Gaza. It's not like a world-changing thing like that where all of a sudden there's a before and then snap and then there's the after. It's not like a curtain where you're on one side and then you're on the other. There's a lot that has to happen with these things, and as the legal states are finding they are experimenting through trial and error to find the policies that need to to happen, or the best policies going forward. And as Paul said, it's not going to be like a federal program where all of a sudden there's a federal cannabis legalization. It's more that the feds will get out of the way and let states conduct their own measures. Let states conduct their own policies in terms of cannabis, the way they do with a lot of other things, alcohol included. Utah is mostly dry state, and Wisconsin is conversely very wet, soaking wet, if you like, in terms of alcohol laws and counties that imbibe in the drink. So different states have different laws concerning alcohol too, and as Paul mentioned, that's likely what it's going to look like for the federal policy regarding cannabis. Instead of them getting in the way and making their own network and sort of dictating what states can do, I think they'll just move out of the way and say, hey, it's Schedule 3 now. Whatever you states want to do with it, by all means, go for that. And on that note, I wanted to mention one thing that came out earlier this week. This was published again by Marijuana Moment, publication that you are familiar with now, listener. I definitely love the work they do, and I try and bring you some interesting stories when they publish them. And the headline of this one, which was published October 26th, reads, "Traffic death rates fell in states that legalized cannabis, new study finds, while those that kept criminalization saw slight increase." Now, this was published by Ben Adlin, and the article, which I will not read fully, but I'll give you the gist here. States that legalized cannabis in 2016 saw meaningful declines in traffic fatalities during the years immediately following the policy change. This is a study done by Quartz Advisor. Takeaways, though, he mentions, were less clear over a longer period of time that included years the report describes as anomalies nationwide. Those, I'm guessing, even without going to the bottom, would include the pandemic years when we know traffic and driving incidents were way off the charts for a lot of different reasons that had nothing to do with legal cannabis. Ultimately, the paper concludes motor vehicle safety, quote, should not be a significant concern for marijuana legalization initiatives, especially when measured against alcohol. This obviously was something that just came up in my conversation with Paul Armentano of NORML. This is something that I think that it is a mistake. There is a little bit of this going on right now where there's equivocating of traffic laws concerning alcohol use and traffic laws concerning cannabis use. And what I really like about this study is that they point out there is a difference. That even though we kind of look at regulations for alcohol as a model for what we may do with cannabis, it's not a perfect model of what we should do, because there is a difference in what those substances and their effects are on us. And what this study says is that alcohol's effects on us in terms of driving and operating motor vehicles are not the same as cannabis. Another quote here is, as of yet, studies have failed to show that legalization of cannabis has resulted in any significant increase in traffic fatalities in the places where it's been legalized. However, the same cannot be said for alcohol, an intoxicant that remains legal, widely available, and deeply ingrained in our culture. The findings are not peer-reviewed, I wanted to mention. Examined traffic fatality data from 4 states that legalized adult-use cannabis in 2016. Those states would be California, Maine, Massachusetts, and Nevada. Quartz Advisor then compared those states' vehicle death rates to the national average, as well as to rates in 5 states where marijuana remained illegal during the period. Those 5 states were Idaho, Indiana, Kansas, Nebraska, and Wyoming. In the 3 years following the change, the report says none of the 4 legalized states saw an increase in traffic deaths. Most, in fact, saw declines. That's a far better outcome than in the 5 states the report examined where marijuana remained illegal, which together experienced a 1.7% increase in their combined traffic death rate from 2016 to 2019. And then they go on to kind of explain how the picture gets muddier when the analysis was expanded to include data from 2020 and 2021, which, as I mentioned, include pandemic years. And obviously, I think any studies done of any kind of human behavior, you should really just throw those out in pandemic years or put them in their own category. Don't throw them out, but look at them separately in a vacuum from the data that's from non-pandemic years, because as we know, that's just a major factor that you cannot discount when you're trying to look at human behavior and the results of those things. So that is all that I will go through of that article. There's more information there. I will certainly link it in the show description notes, as I always do. If you're interested in reading it yourself, which I encourage you to do, you can click on that link or head to marijuanamoment.com and check out that article. They publish great stuff. I highly encourage you to read what they do. And that's all for me this week. I wanted to get that story to you, and I really appreciate my guest, Paul Armentano, for coming on and giving us some wonderful perspective about where cannabis has come from, legal cannabis, that is, what the landscape used to look like in the U.S. when he first started fighting this fight. It's still not where any of us wants it to be, but you have to be encouraged when you look at the progress over the last few decades, where we are now versus where we've come from. We have made progress. We are moving, and it is an exciting time to be a cannabis enthusiast. So I think that it's not going to be too much more time until we do have cannabis on Schedule 3, and we do have this interstate market of commerce allowing businesses to sort of send supplies to one another. You'll be able to outsource better cannabis grown outdoors from other states for your operation in some state that gets cold 6 months out of the year, like Illinois, which just got cold on Halloween this week. It was snowing. You may have been out for trick-or-treating. I really hope that went better for you than it did for some people around our building. I know that it was, we had a lot of snow-covered costumes around the building, and so that's something that, cold does affect cannabis plants, and obviously, depending on where you're going to grow it or not, that impacts your profits, your bottom line of a business. And so the ability to have different outsourcing and communication and different business arrangements between operations in different states, that's just one example of what, rescheduling cannabis out of Schedule 1, something that's going to allow for. And there's a lot more exciting stuff down the horizon, and I will be looking at and talking about all of it right here on the Cannabis Man podcast. Be sure to subscribe to the show, follow us on X and Instagram and Facebook, and go ahead and support the show down in the show description notes if you feel that you enjoyed what this episode brought for you, and it'll help us continue bringing these shows out in the future, these cannabis conversations that I love having with people as this legalization effort is moving forward, chronicling all these changes in real time. I love doing it, and I want to keep bringing it to you, and your support very, very much makes that possible. So thank you for listening to the show and supporting it, and I'll be back again next week with another episode of the Cannabis Man podcast. Bye-bye. Cannabis Man is 100% originally crafted by myself, Don Kleppen. Original theme music written and composed by Yusu Kim, aka Goodson.